would. She was dreadfully homesick for him, did not sleep nights, and cried. Sometimes the veterinary surgeon of the regiment, Smirnov, a young man who lodged in the wing of her house, came to see her evenings. He related incidents, or they played cards together. This distracted her. The most interesting of his stories were those of his own life. He was married and had a son, but he had separated from his wife because she had deceived him, and now he hated her and sent her 40 rubles a month for his son's support. Olenka sighed, shook her head, and was sorry for him. "Well, the Lord keep you," she said as she saw him off to the door by candlelight. "Thank you for coming to kill time with me. May God give you health. Mother in heaven," she spoke very sedately, very judiciously, imitating her husband. The veterinary surgeon had disappeared behind the door when she called out after him, "Do you know, Vladimir Platonich, you ought to make up with your wife. Forgive her, if only for the sake of your son. The child understands everything, you may be sure." When Pustovalov returned, she told him in a low voice about the veterinary surgeon and his unhappy family life, and they sighed and shook their heads, and talked about the boy who must be homesick for his father. Then, by a strange association of ideas, they both stopped before the sacred images, made genuflections, and prayed to God to send them children. And so the Pustovalovs lived for full 6 years, quietly and peaceably, in perfect love and harmony. But once in the winter, Vasily Andreyich, after drinking some hot tea, went out into the lumber yard without a hat on his head and caught a cold and took sick. He was treated by the best physicians, but the malady progressed, and he died after an illness of 4 months. Olenka was again left a widow. "To whom have you left me, my darling?" she wailed after the funeral. "How shall I live now without you, wretched creature that I am? Pity me, good people, pity me, fatherless and motherless, all alone in the world." She went about dressed in black and weepers, and she gave up wearing hats and gloves for good. She hardly left the house except to go to church and to visit her husband's grave. She almost led the life of a nun. It was not until 6 months had passed that she took off the weepers and opened her shutters. She began to go out occasionally in the morning to market with her cook. But how she lived at home and what went on there could only be surmised. It could be surmised from the fact that she was seen in her little garden drinking tea with the veterinarian while he read the paper out loud to her, and also from the fact that once, on meeting an acquaintance at the post office, she said to her, "There is no proper veterinary inspection in our town. That is why there is so much disease. You constantly hear of people getting sick from the milk and becoming infected by the horses and cows. The health of domestic animals ought really to be looked after as much as that of human beings." She repeated the veterinarian's words and held the same opinions as he about everything. It was plain that she could not exist a single year without an attachment, and she found her new happiness in the wing of her house. In any one else this would have been condemned, But no one could think ill of Olenka. Everything in her life was so transparent. She and the veterinary surgeon never spoke about the change in their relations. They tried, in fact, to conceal it, but unsuccessfully, for Olenka could have no secrets. When the surgeon's colleagues from the regiment came to see him, she poured tea and served the supper, and talked to them about the cattle plague, the foot and mouth disease, and the municipal slaughterhouses. The surgeon was dreadfully embarrassed, and after the visitors had left, he caught her hand and hissed angrily, "Didn't I ask you not to talk about what you don't understand? When we doctors discuss things, please don't mix in. It's getting to be a nuisance." She looked at him in astonishment and alarm, and asked, "But, Volodichka, what am I to talk about?" And she threw her arms round his neck with tears in her eyes, and begged him not to be angry. And they were both happy. But their happiness was of short duration. The veterinary surgeon went away with his regiment, to be gone for good when it was transferred to some distant place, almost as far as Siberia, and Olenka was left alone. Now she was completely alone. Her father had long been dead, and his armchair lay in the attic covered with dust and minus one leg. She got thin and homely, and the people who met her on the street no longer looked at her as they had used to, nor smiled at her. Evidently her best years were over, past and gone, and a new, dubious life was to begin, which it were better not to think about. In the evening Olenka sat on the steps and heard the music playing and the rockets bursting in the Tivoli, but it no longer aroused any response in her. She looked listlessly into the yard, thought of nothing, wanted nothing, and when night came on, she went to bed and dreamed of nothing but the empty yard. She ate and drank as though by compulsion. And what was worst of all, she no longer held any opinions. She saw and understood everything that went on around her, but she could not form an opinion about it. She knew of nothing to talk about. And how dreadful not to have opinions! For instance, you see a bottle, or you see that it is raining, or you see a muzhik riding by in a wagon. But what the bottle, or the rain, or the muzhik are for, or what the sense of them all is, you cannot tell. You cannot tell, not for 1,000 rubles. In the days of Kukin and Pustovalov, and then of the veterinary surgeon, Olenka had had an explanation for everything, and would have given her opinion freely, no matter about what. But now there was the same emptiness in her heart and brain as in her yard. It was as galling and bitter as a taste of wormwood. Gradually the town grew up all around. The gypsy road had become a street, and where the Tivoli and the lumber yard had been, there were now houses and a row of side streets. How quickly time flies! Olenka's house turned gloomy, the roof rusty, the shed slanting. Dock and thistles overgrew the yard. Olenka herself had aged and grown homely.